Her ex-husband and his new girlfriend headed to a party where they unexpectedly ran into his stunning ex-wife. The Fitzgerald mansion sparkled like a gem under the starry sky. It was the most anticipated party of the year, bringing together the city's most influential people who exchanged fake smiles and secrets hidden behind expensive champagne. Richard stepped out of a sports car, escorting Carolina, whose presence was impossible to ignore. She radiated almost otherworldly charm, dressed in a long red gown. With carefully thought-out cuts, she clearly wanted to show everyone that she held a special place next to Richard. "You look flawless," he mumbled, adjusting his jacket. "Remember, we're the most important couple here." But there was a noticeable hint of anxiety in his voice. Caroline noticed it, though she didn't say anything. As they walked through the main area, they were surrounded by the soft sounds of a string quartet and the buzz of conversation. Richard greeted familiar faces, flashing his charm. Everything seemed perfect until he saw her. Evelyn was standing by the fireplace, looking quietly stunning, with a smile on her lips and a glass of wine in her hand. She wore a classic black dress, but her posture said she completely owned the moment. Her hair was swept into an elegant bun, showcasing delicate earrings that sparkled like a constellation. Impossible to miss her. Richard lost his focus for a moment. Something tightened in his chest as a painful memory surfaced, one he didn't want to acknowledge. Was it guilt? Nostalgia? Or maybe regret? Carolina noticed his gaze and coolly asked, "Who is she?" "My ex-wife," Richard replied, his voice barely above a whisper. She seemed calm, but not in a good way. "When she saw you," Carolina noticed with a hint of sarcasm. She was chatting with a small group of people who were laughing at something she said. When her eyes finally met Richard's, she subtly raised her glass in a casual greeting. It was a small gesture, but definitely meaningful. Then Richard heard a masculine voice that snapped him out of his daze. It was Gregory, an old friend who was organizing the event. "Hey, let me introduce you to some investors. Good company, Carolina." She smiled, but her gaze stayed glued to Evelyn. "Of course, Gregory, this is Carolina," Richard quickly introduced. They got pulled into a circle of conversation, but Richard could barely focus. His mind was bouncing between Evelyn's presence and Carolina's frozen expression. When he finally managed to break away a bit, Carolina tugged at his sleeve. "You look tense," she said, her tone soft but still sounding accusatory. "It's not like that," he replied, but his eyes kept searching for Evelyn among the guests. After a while, what was bound to happen happened. Inevitably, Evelyn made her way over to them, keeping that same calm vibe she had all evening. "Richard," she said, her tone polite yet distant. "What a surprise. I didn't know you'd be here." "Isn't it amazing?" Caroline chimed in, not hiding the bite in her voice. "Seems like she still has some kind of pull on you." "Don't be ridiculous," Richard replied, avoiding her gaze. Meanwhile, Evelyn continued to watch them from a distance, her smile unwavering, but her eyes held a mix of satisfaction and something else, in the midst of the melancholy. As the guests danced and chatted, Richard realized that no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't ignore Evelyn's presence. She seemed to be in total control, radiating a confidence he'd never seen before. And even though he didn't quite understand what that meant, something inside him was telling him that the night was going to end differently than he had planned. He couldn't shake the feeling of anxiety. When Carolina went to grab some drinks, he watched as his ex-wife mingled with a small group of people. She looked confident, full of life, absolutely not the person he remembered. The woman he once knew, Evelyn, was no longer that insecure shadow who spent long nights waiting for him after their meetups. She wasn't the one begging for his attention while he ignored her anymore. Now she was a symbol of strength that he barely recognized. Meanwhile, Carolina, looking more suspicious, returned with 2 glasses of champagne and sat down next to him. "You've been acting weird ever since you saw her," she said bluntly. "What's going on between you two?" He tried to brush her off, but Carolina's gaze was fixed on him. He didn't say anything, but his words sounded empty. Richard and Evelyn's marriage looked perfect on paper. He was an ambitious, charismatic businessman, always surrounded by influential people. She, on the other hand, was a gentle, devoted, and talented writer who put her own dreams aside for him. At first, there was love, passion, even companionship. But Richard's ambitions consumed everything. Evelyn attended events and parties with him, but soon realized she was just an accessory in his life. He never noticed her efforts, or her sacrifices. "Didn't you know that I have dreams too?" She said this in the heat of an argument. "I wanted to publish my books. I wanted to be more than just Richard, Mora's wife." "Oh, not this again," Ellen snapped back. "I'm working hard to give us this life. Everything you have is because of me. You should be grateful." His words left a mark. He didn't see her pain, her loneliness while he was off at work. Over time, Evelyn realized that those business meetings weren't just meetings. They were the start of something betraying. It was careful at first, but soon it became impossible to ignore. After ignoring it for a while, she held back tears and asked him, "Are you seeing someone else?" He didn't deny it, just shrugged it off, saying she was overreacting. "Evelyn, if you were more like them, confident and fun, things would be different." That was the last straw. Feeling completely empty, Evelyn gathered her dignity and walked away. It was tough, but the divorce gave her a freedom she never imagined. She rebuilt her life, rediscovered her passion for writing, and did something Richard never expected. She blossomed. As Evelyn strolled across the room at the party, she felt like a new person. He couldn't shake off the nagging memories. He tried to convince himself that he had no regrets, but something in her gaze, a mix of disdain and indifference, made his confidence waver. Coralina, standing next to him, noticed he was distracted. "Yes," she asked coldly. "I left her," he replied bitterly, but not before she became unbearable, always complaining, always wanting more from me. Coralina raised an eyebrow. Maybe she just wanted to feel appreciated. Richard didn't respond. Instead, he took a long sip of champagne, trying to drown it all out. There's a growing feeling that he's not as innocent as he would like to believe. Meanwhile, as the couple argued in a quiet corner, Evelyn was the center of attention. A well-known publisher, captivated by her literary talent, enthusiastically praised her latest book. "You really captured the essence of love and loss, Evelyn. It's a brilliant work," he said. "Thank you," she replied with a serene smile. The pain turned into art can be liberating. Caroline noticed his confusion and stared at him intently. "She wrote about you, you know." She asked him if maybe, just maybe, he was interested. He admitted with a forced smile that he never really knew. "Well, it looked like she had moved on," Caroline shot back. "You should too, Richard." He was struggling with his inner turmoil when Evelyn approached him with a determined look on her face. He felt the weight of inevitability. They needed to talk, and he knew it was going to hurt. When she stopped just a few steps away, it felt like time stood still. "It had been so long since I last saw you. I can't even remember the last time we talked," she started it. Her tone was low but sharp, like a blade. "I think it's time to have a chat." She stood tall and confident. He was trying to compose himself, adjusting his tie, but it was clear he was uncomfortable. Carolina stood nearby, silent, but her eyes were fixed on Ellen. She was watching her every move. Her voice, which was supposed to sound calm, came out tense. "Do we need to talk here?" "Yeah, I think we do," she replied, her voice low and restrained. "It's hard to find you anywhere else when you're always busy, Richard." He frowned, but before he could respond, Evelyn crossed her arms and went on. "I thought after all these years you'd change. But it seems like your priority is still showing off your perfect girlfriends." She shot a glance at Carolina, who was frozen but kept her cool. "This isn't the time or place," Richard replied, his tone dripping with irritation. "And when will be the right time?" Evelyn shot back, raising an eyebrow. "While you're busy impressing strangers, our daughter is at home wondering why her dad never calls." "Of course, sending money every month should be enough, right? After all, it's always easier to buy someone's affection than to actually show it." Richard felt his throat go dry as Carolina turned away from him, clearly uncomfortable. "It's not fair," he said defensively. "I'm doing everything I can and working hard to give her everything I can." "Doing everything you can?" Evelyn laughed bitterly. "Richard, Emmy doesn't need a bank account. She needs a dad. Someone who knows her, her friends, and what she loves. Who's going to be there for her at night? Do you even care?" "She's involved in a research project?" "Of course not. You're way more worried about your next car or the next party where you can show off your latest win." Carolina took a deep breath. Her expression turned serious. Evelyn turned to her, her eyes sparkling with a mix of sarcasm and sympathy. "Carolina, I hope you can be patient. If you too want to get anywhere, you're going to need it, because his constant ghosting, vague excuses, and texts he never responds to are becoming unbearable." "That's enough," Richard interrupted. His voice was louder than he meant it to be, and a few people nearby glanced his way, but soon went back to their conversations, pretending they didn't hear. "You don't need to put on a show," Evelyn said, tilting her head slightly. "I'm just reminding you that some responsibilities don't disappear just because you ignore them." "Good luck, Carolina." She took a step back, staying calm and composed, while Richard looked visibly shaken. Evelyn smiled, but it wasn't warm, and then she walked to another corner of the room where a group of people seemed really happy to see her. Carolina glanced at Richard, her expression even tougher than before. "She's right," she asked. "Is she exaggerating?" he mumbled, grabbing a glass of champagne from a passing tray. "You know how women like her act after they get married, always making a scene." She stayed silent, watching Richard gulp down his champagne. That evening, Richard couldn't help but stare at Evelyn. She was surrounded by people who seemed genuinely taken with her. The editor who had talked to her earlier reappeared, along with a well-known figure. Evelyn smiled modestly as she responded, but there was something in her gaze that hinted she knew exactly the impression she was making. Every laugh and compliment just made Richard more angry and uncomfortable. He downed another glass of champagne, then another, and finally switched to whiskey. Carolina watched him, increasingly disappointed. "You're obsessed with her," she said, her tone dripping with irritation. "Don't you get it? Evelyn always knew how to manipulate people. Or maybe you just never realized how good she was at drawing everyone in." Attention shifted as Richard stood in the corner with an empty glass in his hand. His eyes were glued to Evelyn. He wasn't sure if it was the drink or the weight of his own choices weighing on him, but it felt like this party was a cruel metaphor for his life, a show where he was just a background player in Evelyn's story. Evelyn glanced his way one last time before leaving, and for a moment he saw something in her eyes that wasn't anger, but something even more painful, indifference. It hit him hard. The ride home was quiet. She was sitting in the passenger seat, arms crossed, staring off into space, lost in thoughts of drinks and a night that had gone wrong. In the back seat, he didn't say a word, knowing he should say something but couldn't find the right words. Or maybe he just didn't have the guts to face the truth. As soon as the driver parked the car outside Richard's fancy apartment, Carolina got out without waiting for him. Once inside, she finally broke the silence. "So this is what it's come to," she said abruptly, her voice full of frustration. "You're just going to pretend that nothing happened at the party?" Richard closed the door with a heavy sigh. "It's not that simple. Carolina, Evelyn always knows how to make an impression." Carolina shouted. "She just told the truth, and that's the worst part of it all." "I think she's right," he admitted. "She's exaggerating," he replied, trying to sound convincing, but his voice betrayed him. Carolina crossed her arms and stared at him intently. "You don't even know your own daughter, Richard. All this time we've been together, you've never brought her here." How old is she anyway? Who's her best friend? You don't even know, do you? Richard ran his hand over his face in frustration. Caroline, I'm doing everything I can. I'm working hard to keep this house, this lifestyle. Isn't that enough? No, she replied. And you know what's worse? You're still stuck in the past, still thinking about Evelyn. Your behavior at the party was ridiculous. You were drinking and watching her all night. That's not true, he lied. But Caroline could see through him. She shook her head in disappointment. I should have realized this sooner. You're going to insist you didn't stare at her all night? You didn't even try to hide it. You're exaggerating, he replied, but his words felt empty. Carolina froze, took a deep breath, and finally asked, Tell me, Richard, am I just a game to you, or am I just the next one in line until you get tired of me? This has nothing to do with you or her, he started, but his thoughts were all over the place. And then, at the most heated moment, he made the worst mistake. Evelyn, please, you have to understand. The name slipped out before he could stop himself. The silence that followed was deafening. Don't follow me. Just stay. With his ghosts, Richard. And with those words, she walked out, slamming the door behind her. The next morning, Richard woke up with a pounding headache, more from shame than a hangover. Memories of the fight with Carolina were eating at him, but something much deeper was bothering him. Evelyn's words. He grabbed his phone and called his secretary. Cancel everything for today, he said, his voice raspy. I'm not going into the office. Got it, Mr. M.O., she replied, but he hung up before she could say anything else. Richard spent the rest of the morning wandering around his apartment, unable to. Richard was feeling anxious and decided to get out of the house. He headed to the mall, not really sure why he was going. When he got there, he found Evelyn standing there, and his words caught her off guard. She looked at him with a mix of alertness and irritation. Richard stood there, feeling lost, as if he was suddenly aware of all the weight of his mistakes. Evelyn's voice was steady but as cold as ice. What are you doing here? Richard tried to gather his thoughts. He knew that whatever he said would probably sound empty, but he couldn't just leave things as they were. Trying to hide the turmoil inside, he finally spoke up. I wanted to talk to Emma. I know I've let a lot of time slip away, but I need to be close to her. I want to make things right. But her face was so expressionless, even though I could feel the storm of emotions inside me. You want to be close to her? She asked with a hint of sarcasm. And I thought, is this really the right time for this? Richard, you haven't been around for years, and now you suddenly want to come back and fix everything in a single day? Richard froze, not knowing what to say. Her words felt like cold knives piercing right through my heart. I looked down, finding the strength to keep the conversation going. He finally said, I was wrong. His voice was shaky but sincere. I know I messed everything up, but I want to try to start over, for Emma, for us. Please give me a chance. Evelyn sighed, and a shadow of doubt crossed her face as she glanced at Emma, who stood silently by, watching everything unfold. You want to be her father? Richard asked quietly. Then start by earning her trust. You can begin by just being here, not just when it's convenient for you, Evelyn. She didn't wait for a response. She turned away and, without looking back at him, walked over. Come on, sweetheart, it's time to go home, she said gently, and the girl followed her without a glance back. Richard stood there, stunned by her words and her determination. He felt like his world was falling apart. The feelings he had been hiding from himself began to surface, and it was already too late. As they walked further away, his heart was filled with regret and worry. With each step, Evelyn and Emma got farther away, and with every step, Richard felt like he was losing a chance that might have been his last. After Evelyn and Emma left, Richard was left standing there alone, staring at his daughter. The expression on her face was a mix of surprise and wariness. What are you doing here? She asked flatly. I just wanted to see my daughter, he replied, trying to keep his cool. Evelyn crossed her arms, keeping Emma behind her. Without any warning or plan in mind, she said, "Do you really think it works that way?" Richard took a deep breath. "I know I messed everything up. I'm just trying to fix it." "Hey, Evelyn, can I spend some time with her?" Evelyn went quiet, her gaze drifting to Cammy, who clearly felt awkward. Finally, she sighed heavily and said, "Fine, but just for half an hour and only because Emma seems like she wants to talk to you." They headed to the nearest cafe. Emma was sitting on the other side of the table, stirring her cup of hot chocolate. Despite Richard being there, he felt a distance between them like an invisible wall. "So, how are you?" he asked, trying to sound casual. "Good," she replied briefly, not going into details. "I heard about your research during the school project." He mentioned it while recalling what Evelyn had told him. "That night sounds amazing," Emma said, looking at him in surprise. "How did he know about that?" "It's about the solar system. I made Saturn out of clay." Richard smiled. "Saturn is my favorite planet, really?" she asked skeptically. "Yeah, the rings have always fascinated me since I was your age. I did a project on it too." The conversation continued a bit nervously, but with each passing word, Emma started to relax. Richard listened closely to everything she said, absorbing details he had overlooked before. After half an hour had passed, Evelyn showed up to pick her up. Emma glanced at Richard before leaving. "You'll see me again," she said. "Yeah," he replied firmly. Evelyn looked at him critically, trying to gauge if he was being sincere. "I hope you keep your promise." As Emma got in the car, Evelyn stood in the street with her arms crossed. "You're trying now, but have you thought about all the time you've wasted?" she asked, her voice steady but laced with hidden frustration. "I've been thinking about it a lot these past few days," he admitted honestly. "Evelyn, I read your books, every single word. I saw how I've suffered, and now I can see how much Emma is suffering. You have every right to hate me, but please let me be a real part of her life this time." Evelyn looked at him closely, trying to see if he was genuinely remorseful. "I don't hate you, Richard, but I don't trust you either. You need to prove that you mean what you say, not just for me, but for Emma." He nodded, knowing he'd need to do a lot more than just talk to win back his daughter. The next day, Richard parked his car near Emma's school, 10 minutes early, right after making plans with Evelyn. Picking up his daughter every day was a small commitment, but for him, it felt like a big step, a way to make up for lost time. He watched other parents with their everyday conversations and felt out of place among them. They all seemed so integrated into their family routines, while he felt like a stranger. There he was, waiting outside the school with a backpack slung over his shoulder and her shy smile lighting up his day. When she spotted him, something inside him warmed. "Hi, Dad," Emma called out as she ran over. "Hey, Angel," he replied, opening his arms. "The door is for her." "How was your day?" he asked. Emma excitedly started telling him about her day, her science project, and how her teacher praised her work. Richard listened intently, letting his daughter's voice fill the emptiness inside him. It was a sound he hadn't heard in a long time, and now he realized just how much he had missed it. On the way home, Emma, full of energy as always, suddenly said something that caught him off guard. "You know, Mom is seeing someone now," she said casually. Richard almost jumped. Even though he felt like he was losing control, he managed to keep it together. Inside, he was a bundle of nerves, trying to hide the jealousy that hit him like a ton of bricks. "Really?" he asked, trying to sound casual. "Yeah, he's super nice," Emma continued, completely oblivious to his unease. "His name's Victor. He takes us to the park and bought me ice cream the other day. Next week, we're going on a cruise. It's going to be so much fun." Richard swallowed hard, gripping the steering wheel tighter. The thought of another guy stepping into the space where he had failed felt like a punch to the gut, something he couldn't even bring himself to acknowledge out loud. There was something about the World Cup that he never really thought about, even though their marriage ended a long time ago. He was glad that he made you happy. Richard managed to say this with a strained smile. Emma nodded, not noticing the fake cheerfulness in his voice. He was cheerful, and his mom seemed happy too. She was laughing more often now. Those words hit her like a bolt of lightning. Evelyn was happy without him. Maybe even happier than she ever was with him. He felt small and insignificant, like a shadow from her past. When they arrived at Evelyn's house, she was standing at the door waiting for them. Richard saw her from a distance. I noticed her calm smile when she greeted Emma, and a mix of feelings rolled through me. A gratitude for raising such an amazing daughter, and a bitter envy that she had already moved on. Evelyn walked up to the car, exchanging a few words with Richard about Emma's day. She was so calm and confident that Richard couldn't help but wonder how the woman he once knew, who used to be under his thumb, had become so independent and out of reach. "Thanks for taking her," Evelyn said with a light smile. "Of course," he replied. "That's all I can do." As he turned away on his way home, Richard felt a deep emptiness. Her words echoed in his head, a constant reminder of everything he had lost. When he got back to his apartment, the silence felt louder than ever. He opened a bottle of wine, but stopped before pouring himself a glass. He knew drinking wouldn't change anything. He sat down on the couch, staring at Evelyn's books, still sitting on the table. He had read them all, as if they held the key to understanding her, but now she felt farther away than ever. Her voice played in his mind, cautious and soft. "I wanted to talk. I'd been thinking about us." He closed his eyes, feeling the weight of guilt and regret. Rowlyn was an incredible woman, and he knew it, but he realized that right now he couldn't give her what she deserved. "Rowlyn," he started, his voice low. "I don't know if this is a good idea. I just want to understand what happened." "But I thought we were okay," she said, her voice getting firmer. "Then, after that party, everything fell apart. You became so distant, and then you called me." Evelyn paused, the heavy silence hanging between them felt almost unbearable. Richard took a deep breath. "Let me know if you need any adjustments. Here's a colloquial translation of the text you provided." Trying to find the right words, he finally said, "I'm sorry for what happened, but I think you deserve someone who's not as messed up as I am right now, or still stuck on her." Rowlyn asked, and there was pain in her voice. Richard closed his eyes and fell silent. After a long pause, Rowlyn said, "I get it." With a tired sigh, she added, "I hope you find what you're looking for, Richard, and I hope it's worth it." Before he could respond, the call ended. He tossed his phone onto the couch next to him, feeling emptier than ever. He spent the rest of the evening staring at the ceiling, reliving every moment of the conversation and hanging on every word Evelyn said. He knew he had to change, not just to win Evelyn back or impress Carolyn, but for himself and, most importantly, for Emma. As the sun began to rise, Richard finally made a decision. He didn't know what his journey would look like, but he was determined to be a better father. Maybe he could never fix the past, but he knew he could try to build a future worth having, and that was all that mattered. Richard stood at the edge of the pit, contemplating. In the morning, through the slightly open curtains, a bottle of wine he had ignored the night before sat untouched on the table. Even though he was tired, his mind was racing more than ever. Evelyn moved on. Emma could find another dad, but he was stuck in a whirlwind of regret and self-hatred. He wasn't sure how long he had been sitting there, just staring into space, but eventually he got up. He grabbed his phone and started typing a message to Evelyn. He wanted to insist on meeting up, having a talk, but every time he tried to type something, he ended up deleting it. He knew that any word he said would just sound like an excuse. Evelyn deserved better. Emma deserved better. Those thoughts echoed in his head as he grabbed a cup of coffee and stepped outside, not really knowing where he was headed, but feeling like he needed to get away. Richard left his apartment. He needed some fresh air. He drove around the city, reminiscing about how he had destroyed something beautiful that once was. A few hours later, he found himself in front of a flower shop, not quite sure why he went in, but he ended up buying a bouquet of white flowers. Evelyn's favorite flowers were lilies, but as he walked back to the car, it hit him. It wasn't Evelyn who needed the flowers, it was Emma. He showed up at the usual spot with a bouquet in hand, not really caring about anything else. When Emma finally came out through the gate, her eyes widened in surprise when she saw him with the flowers. "For me?" she asked, looking amazed. "Of course," Richard replied with a smile. "You deserve all the flowers in the world." Emma took the bouquet, and her shy smile warmed Richard's heart. "They're so beautiful, Dad." "Thank you." They headed to the car, and all the way there, Emma held onto the flowers. The flowers were like the greatest gift she had ever received. As they drove home, they talked about her day, her friends, and even the upcoming science project. But then, while playing with the flower petals, Emma said something that made Richard freeze for a moment. "Victor gives Mom flowers too, but you've never given her flowers." Richard felt a knot in his stomach. He quickly glanced at his daughter in the rearview mirror, but Emma was still engrossed in the bouquet, not realizing how heavy her words were. "No, Emma probably never gave her flowers." He admitted, his voice was quiet. She shrugged as if it didn't matter. "Looks like you're trying now." Yeah, he tried to respond, but the words wouldn't come out. She was right. He was trying, but why was it taking so long? Later that evening, when he got home, the phone rang again. For a moment, Richard thought it was someone else, but when he saw Caroline's name on the screen, a weight settled on his chest. He didn't want to answer, but he knew he couldn't keep running from his problems. "Hey, Caroline," he said as he picked up the phone. "Richard," she started. Her tone was calm but firm. "I've been thinking a lot about our last conversation. In our conversation about how we wrapped everything up, there's something I need to tell you before I can move on." Richard leaned back on the couch, bracing himself for what was coming. "You didn't notice, but I really tried everything to get us back together. I ignored all the signs when you were off somewhere else, thinking about someone else. I thought if I was patient, you'd finally let go of the past. But the truth is you never did, and I can't compete with that." "I'm really sorry," Richard started, but she cut him off. "I know you regret it, but I think you need to hear this. You're stuck on what happened between you and Ellen, focusing on love and the regret of what you didn't do for her and your daughter." Richard was silent, not sure how to respond. "I hope you can sort this out," Carolyn said, her voice softening. "Do it for yourself, not for me or her. Because if you don't, you'll never be happy. And honestly, I deserve someone who will truly be with me." "You're right," he admitted, his voice full of sincerity. "Take care of yourself, Carolyn." "Take care, Richard." She told him to hang up. Richard stared at the phone, feeling emptiness that grew deeper with each passing moment. Over the next few days, he spent more time with Emma. He picked her up and dropped her off at school, talked to her about her interests, helped her with projects and other subjects, things he never would have done before. But even with all his efforts to be a better dad, he couldn't shake the thought of Evelyn. The thought of Victor, Emma's perfect boyfriend, nagged at him. He imagined what Victor must be like, kind and everything he wished he could be, being attentive and, most importantly, the kind of person who made Evelyn laugh again. On Thursday, while waiting for her at school, Richard realized he needed to talk to Evelyn, not to try to win her back, but to be open and honest. He had to tell her everything he had kept inside for so long. Evelyn was at home getting ready for a cruise when she heard the doorbell. When she opened the door, she was surprised to see Richard standing there with the most serious look on his face that she had ever seen. Richard said, "I need to talk." "With you," his voice was low and tense. "That's important." Evelyn slowed her movement, but opened the door with a gesture inviting him in. "We don't have much time. I'm going on a trip with Emma tomorrow," she said, trying to sound casual but with a hint of caution in her voice. "I know," Richard replied. "Emma told me about the cruise and about Victor." Evelyn closed her eyes for a moment to deal with the rush of feelings. "Yeah," he admitted. "But what I want to say is much more important." Evelyn stood with her arms crossed, waiting for him to continue. "I've read your books," he started. His voice was shaking a bit as he spoke, and for the first time I really got it. "I saw what you went through, how much I hurt you, and most importantly, I realized how I let Emma down." Evelyn blinked, surprised by his words, but didn't say anything. "I was selfish," Richard continued. "I was so caught up in my work and my image that I never noticed what you needed. I didn't see you, I didn't see Emma, and I'm really sorry about that." She stayed quiet, her face emotionless, but her eyes gave away how she really felt. "I'm not asking for anything. I just want you to know that I realize my mistakes. I've made mistakes, and I'm trying to change for Emma and maybe a little for myself." Evelyn sighed, crossing her arms for Emma, especially for her. Richard nodded, feeling a bit grateful. But then she added, pausing as if she was thinking about how to express her thoughts. "As for me, I've moved on, and I think you should too. Not out of anger, Obi, but because sometimes people just aren't meant to be together." He swallowed hard, but nodded again. "I get it," he replied quietly. Evelyn smiled, a small but genuine smile. "Just be a good dad to Emma, okay?" The only thing that mattered when Richard left was that a heavy weight lifted off his shoulders. He knew the journey ahead would be long, but for the first time he felt like he was in the right place to start. The next morning, when they returned from their cruise, Emma was already waiting for him at school. It had become a part of his daily routine. He was always there, like an anchor in her life. He wasn't sure if Evelyn realized how important this was for him, but Emma was definitely starting to understand. When he saw his daughter come out of the gates with her backpack, chatting animatedly with a friend, he waved to her. She smiled and ran over to him, throwing her arms around him. "Hi, Dad," she said, barely catching her breath. "How was the trip?" he asked. Emma hesitated for a moment, her smile fading a bit. "It was good, but there's something I need to tell you." Richard noticed a change in her tone and opened the car door for her. "All right, we can talk on the way," he said. While they were stuck in traffic, Emma spoke up. "Mom and Victor broke up," she said quietly, with noticeable doubt in her voice. Richard fell silent, taken aback. He looked at his daughter, trying to figure out what she was feeling. "Are you really okay with that?" he asked. Emma shrugged, staring out the window. "I guess. But I don't think he was as great as he seemed at first." Richard tightened his grip on the steering wheel, trying to hide his inner joy at the fact that she was starting to see the truth. "Why do you say that?" he asked. "Because he was totally different on the cruise. At first, he was all fun and games. If I wanted to stay in the pool longer or if Mom wanted to spend more time with me, he was always annoyed." Richard felt his stomach tighten as he remembered Victor. There's this guy who seemed perfect for Emma and Elena, but now it turns out he showed a completely different side. "How's Mom dealing with it?" he asked. Emma thought for a moment and then said, "I think she's sad, but she said she wants to be with someone who loves her for who she is. She said you always have to listen to your instincts, and it seems like she felt this wasn't going to work out." Richard glanced at his daughter in the mirror and said, "Your mom is really wise and she's right. You deserve to be around people who love and respect you. You just be yourself." Emma smiled and relaxed in her chair. "Yeah, you're probably right." Those talks left a chill in his heart, but he knew Emma's future was in his hands. When she came back from school, Richard noticed she seemed calmer, like the cloud hanging over her had finally lifted. "Is she okay?" he asked, trying to sound casual. "Yeah," Emma replied. "Yesterday, we made popcorn and watched a movie. She laughed a lot." Richard smiled with relief. "That's great. You know, your mom is an amazing woman." "Wow, you're lucky. So, you have Emma on your mind, huh?" "I know, and I think she deserves someone who's really good, like you're trying to be." Richard felt a tightness in his chest, but at the same time, a flicker of hope started to grow inside him. He didn't know where this path would lead him, but he was determined to keep going, not just for Emma, but for himself too, and maybe for the chance that one day she'd see him as the man he wants to be. A few days later, on a clear and sunny day, Richard drove to There's a bookstore in the city center where Evelyn usually spent her afternoons. He knew she'd be there, either lost in a book or maybe thinking about a new one. For the past few months, he'd been trying to rebuild their relationship, but not as husband and wife, more like partners in raising Emma. He understood that earning Evelyn's trust back would take time, but Emma had become the strongest bond between them. The days when he picked her up from school and the weekends they spent together were now a natural part of his life. He finally realized how much the little things could matter. So he started feeling really proud of always being there for his daughter, and somehow that made it easier for him to see Evelyn again. When he spotted her sitting by the window in a cafe with a cup of coffee and an open notebook in front of her, she looked calm, and there was a lightness in her posture that Richard hadn't seen in years. He took a deep breath and walked over. "Hope I'm not interrupting," he said with a shy smile. Evelyn looked up in surprise, but relaxed when she saw him. "Richard, no, it's all good. I'm just trying to organize some ideas for my new book," she said as he took a seat. She was sitting across from her, and even though she hadn't invited him, she didn't seem to mind. "Maybe," she replied, closing her notebook, "but it's still early days. Nothing's set in stone yet." Richard nodded, genuinely intrigued. "You know, you have an incredible talent. Your books are just amazing." Evelyn raised an eyebrow a bit wary. "You've told me that before, but it still feels strange to hear it from you." He let out a grim laugh. "Yeah, I probably deserve that. I used to not care about what you and your talent deserved, but I'm trying to change that. Honestly, I wanted to talk to you about—" Evelyn tilted her head, intrigued. He paused to choose his words carefully. "What if we set up an exhibition of your books at the next book festival? Something that celebrates your career, your books, and your impact as a writer." Evelyn fell silent, taken aback. "Are you serious?" she finally asked. "Absolutely serious," he replied. "I've already reached out to some folks. I can organize something special. I thought it would be a great way to show the world what you're all about and inspire you to write a new book." For a moment, Evelyn was quiet, taking in the idea. Her face showed a mix of confusion and excitement. "Richard," she finally said, her voice getting quieter, "why are you doing this?" "Because you deserve it," he replied without hesitation. "Because I've been blind to what you're capable of for too long, and because I believe in you. Evelyn, I've always believed in you. I just didn't know how to show it." Evelyn stared at him for a long time, trying to find any doubt in his eyes, but she saw nothing. In that moment, Richard seemed completely sincere. "I don't know what to say," she admitted, smiling a bit shyly. "Then just say yes," he said. "Let me do this for you." She hesitated for a few more seconds, but then nodded. "Okay, but only if you don't go overboard," he replied, raising his hands in surrender. The next few weeks were intense. Richard threw himself into planning the exhibition, even handling details he would have usually handed off to someone else. He picked out photos that captured the key moments of Evelyn's career, worked with publishers, and even managed to land one of the biggest press conferences dedicated to her. Meanwhile, Evelyn felt, here's a colloquial and authentic translation of the text. It was hard for her to ignore Richard's efforts, but at the same time, she was scared to trust him again. However, seeing his commitment to not just the project, but also to Emma, she gradually started to let her guard down. When the day of the festival finally arrived, Evelyn was blown away by what she saw. The exhibit was elegant and well-organized, and for the first time, she felt like the space truly reflected who she was as a writer and a woman. Richard stood next to Emma, watching her greet the first visitors. And when he was giving interviews, he didn't want to draw attention to himself. But at the same time, he felt proud to be part of that moment. "She looks so happy," Emma said, stretching out her response. He answered her more sincerely, "I just did what I should have done a long time ago." Evelyn smiled, but there was something else in her eyes. "You know, Richard, I'm not exactly sure when it happened, but I've noticed that you've changed. And as hard as it is, I'm starting to believe that this change is real." It really is, he said confidently. I know I hurt you badly and I can't change the past, but I'm ready to spend the rest of my life. Evelyn nodded, holding his gaze. I believe you. In the following months, Richard, Evelyn, and Emma's relationship took an unexpected but natural turn. They started spending more time together, not just for Emma's sake, but also because they were rediscovering each other. Evelyn got back to working on her new book, inspired by Richard's constant support. He read every draft, offered constructive feedback, and one evening, while they were at Evelyn's place, Richard was cooking dinner and Emma was helping out. The scene with the mom and the computer was pretty simple, but for each of them, it meant something much deeper: unity. When dinner was ready, everyone sat down at the table. Richard lifted his glass of wine and looked at Evelyn and Emma. I want to say something, he started a bit nervously. You two mean everything to me. I know it took me a while to figure it out, but you saved me from myself. Thank you for giving me a chance to be a better person. Evelyn smiled, touching his hand. We're family, Richard, and that's what really matters. Emma raised her juice glass. Here's to our family. To our family, they all replied. At that moment, as Richard and Evelyn were laughing and chatting, they both knew that the past was finally behind them. The future, bright and full of possibilities, was right in front of them. What do you think about this touching story of forgiveness, love, and reconnecting? Leave your rating from 1 to 10 in the comments and tell us which part you liked the most. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to hit like to help this content reach more people, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out. Don't miss out on any of the thrilling stories full of unexpected twists. And make sure you stick around to check out the video that's popping up on your screen right now. It's another incredible story that you're really going to love. See you soon.